On the 6th of August, 1945, the B-29 bomber Enola Gay dropped an A-bomb nicknamed Little Boy over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. With a detonation of 13 kilotons, the bomb decimated the city within seconds. It was only 3 days later that Nagasaki City suffered its own nuclear attack. These two history-changing explosions marked the end of the Second World War in the Pacific. A bloody war had been ensuing far from the European borders between the Japanese Imperial Army and America. The result of the conflict, more than 3 million dead in a country almost completely marred by devastation. 70 years after the war, Japan got back on its feet and built monuments throughout the country so as to never forget. But behind the modern appearance of the cities that have now been entirely rebuilt, there still remain traces of that horrific period in Japan's history that are yet to be discovered. On the Okinawa Islands, where the Americans disembarked, and around Hiroshima and Nagasaki City, many scientists and enthusiasts have dedicated their lives to revealing some of the last vestiges of the war. During their latest investigations, they have come across precious reminders of the violence that occurred during the conflict, of the fate met by the last civilian survivors of the war, or the terrible damage caused by nuclear warfare. Analyzing these objects from the past reveals the last few months of the year 1945 in a new light, the year that saw the fall of the Japanese Empire and a totally new era for humanity, one of total annihilation. In 1942, Japan had a very powerful empire under the rule of Emperor Hirohito. Allied with Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, its empire spread from North China to Korea, passing through Indochina, the Philippines, and most of Southeast Asia. Through his desire to expand, the emperor sought to assert his control over the region. Without even declaring war with the United States, he launched a raid on their Pearl Harbor base in Hawaii, which was the headquarters of the American Pacific Fleet. On the 7th of December 1941, Admiral Yamamoto sent 6 of his aircraft carriers and 400 planes to attack Pearl Harbor. This attack took the Americans completely by surprise, and the damage was horrific. 2,400 soldiers were killed, and part of the fleet was destroyed.
Day after the attack on Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt made a speech to Congress, the Day of Infamy, and declared war on Japan. So the Americans saw this as an unprovoked sneak attack, and they wanted revenge. And it enabled Roosevelt to overcome isolationist sentiment in the United States that wanted to keep the United States out of the war in Europe.
In order to get their revenge for Pearl Harbor, the American Army focused on taking over the Japanese Empire, island by island. The Marshall Islands, the Solomon Islands, Saipan, and the Philippines. After battle upon battle, the Japanese soldiers began to retreat. For the Americans, a Japanese air assault would be the final step in this inexorable battle over the territory. After the famous Battle of Iwo Jima, the American commander in charge finally targeted Okinawa, the subtropical islands, just to the south of the Japanese archipelago.
Okinawa was strategically important for the Americans because it would cut Japan's supply lines to all of its bases spread out all over Asia, and it enabled America to have a launching pad for the invasion of mainland Japan.
The Okinawa invasion had the code name Operation Iceberg. It was the biggest assault of the Pacific military campaign. 290,000 soldiers were mobilized, and a high-powered air force helped support the assault on the ground. In March 1945, the American GIs started securing the small Kerama Islands. On the 1st of April, they landed on the west coast of the main island of Okinawa. There, they were only met with weak resistance and made their way, without much difficulty, to the center and north of the island. It was in the south, where there are hundreds of natural caves, that the Japanese resistance managed to organize itself properly. The South Okinawa Forest, therefore, became the scene of one of the most violent battles in the Pacific. It is a place where thousands of Japanese soldiers would go for their last battle. Photojournalist and amateur archaeologist Tetsugi Hamada has been carrying out his own searches in Okinawa for 15 years. In the middle of the jungle, they are still able to find traces of the Japanese Army's defense system.
This here is a hole, which we'd call a spider hole in Japanese. It's where the Imperial Army soldiers would hide themselves. You could probably fit about 1 or 2 soldiers in them. From this height, you could wait for the enemy to come close before shooting.
At the bottom of the hole, there would be an extra cavity to allow the soldier to make himself invisible from the surface, in case the enemy showed up. Hundreds of holes like this were dug by soldiers in the forest so that they could take the Americans by surprise. Behind these holes, Tetsugi also found a vast network of trenches.
This is a trench that would have been used by many soldiers. They can be as deep as 4'3" or 4'11" inches, so that they can move around, crouched down, without being seen by the enemy.
But despite this maze of vegetation, the Japanese soldiers were no match for the American Armada. At the front line, at the ocean front, the Japanese soldiers would fall, one after the other. Tetsugi Hamada is still able to find remains of soldiers in almost every trench.
Oh, look, there's one here. And this too. They're all damaged. It must have been bombed. It's quite astonishing. That's a femur. It's all in pieces, poor guy. The soldiers that were here must have died from a direct bomb strike, which threw them against the rocks. The state of these scattered bones would suggest that they were directly hit by the explosion.
Battles raged for several weeks. The Japanese were perfectly familiar with the terrain and knew all the best places to hide. But the Americans were in a hurry to finish things. To force them out of hiding, they set up some effective but very cruel methods. Tetsugi's new investigation reveals just how extreme these two camps were. It's a limestone cave, and the Japanese soldiers dug down into the deepest tunnels of the cave, only leaving to launch their attacks on the American troops. Alongside Tetsugi Hamada, 100 students from all over Japan have come to help him carry out his searches.
Look, this is what we call a campan, which was given to Japanese soldiers as survival rations, and they'd keep it with them. It was probably burnt by a flamethrower because it's completely charred.
These food rations bear traces of flamethrowers. The Americans would use this weapon frequently to drive out the Japanese troops. Some soldiers surrendered to the fight and became prisoners of war, but thousands of others were burnt alive or asphyxiated. Some would rather kill themselves than fall into the hands of the Americans.
That's a grenade from the Imperial Japanese Army. The soldiers were each armed with 2 of them, one to attack the enemy and the other to kill oneself. During our searches, we found skulls where the jaw has completely exploded. This can be explained by the fact that they killed themselves by detonating the grenade against themselves.
Many of the objects that were found during the searches are sorted out here in this museum run by Isamu Kuniyoshi, one of Tetsugi Hamada's friends. Isamu has also been carrying out his own searches for almost 60 years. He has accumulated the biggest collection of remains from the Okinawa battle. He uses the shelves to store the guns, bombs, anti-personnel mines, and grenades. This impressive collection of weapons bears witness to the intensity of the 3-month-long Okinawa battle. Some of the most personal items in his collection include the dog tags of hundreds of Japanese and American soldiers. They are often the only souvenirs left of the soldiers who died at the front line.
Here they've written Yama N3475. It's an identity tag. All of the soldiers were given a personal ID number. Only officers had their full names engraved on these tags, whereas ordinary soldiers were only given a number. So we're only able to give back the tags to the families of officers.
As battle raged on the ground, another key battle was taking place at sea. Several American and English destroyers and aircraft carriers converged at sea to support the marine assault. As a counterattack, the Japanese military headquarters chose a terrifying and desperate tactic. They sent kamikaze pilots. In April 1945, the Japanese commander coordinated the most widespread suicide attack of the Pacific War. In Okinawa alone, more than 1,400 kamikaze pilots were sent to bombard the enemy fleet.
From the end of 1944, the kamikaze strategy was without doubt the only option they had left. It was an inhuman strategy that no one would come back from. However, these attacks weren't carried out by people in a fit of hysterics. To the contrary, I think the kamikazes were very calm people who just accepted their responsibilities.
Off the Okinawa coast lie many ships that were sunk by the kamikaze planes. Jan Verruch is a professional diver, originally from Germany, who moved to the archipelago several years ago and now knows the seafloor of this region like the back of his hand. Today, he is off to explore a wreck from the Okinawa battle, USS Emmons. During the Second World War, this 348-foot-long destroyer was a gem of the American Navy. In June 1944, it was involved in Operation Overlord and supported the Normandy landings. It was then converted into a minesweeper and sent to Okinawa to take part in Operation Iceberg. And that's where its journey would end.
The wreck is in an okay condition because not so many divers are entering or diving here. It's rather deep, with about 45-meter deep. So therefore, you need rather skill to dive there. The wreck has only been discovered in 2001 by the Japanese Coast Guard and some fishermen. The fishermen noticed some oil in the sea here around, and they asked to the Coast Guard. They found some traces on a sonar, to my knowledge.
The USS Emmons lies to the north of Okinawa, off the coast of the Koori Island. The destroyer lies on its side. On the ship itself, it is perfectly easy to make out the traces of its military past. On the deck, there are still several anti-air cannons in place. And, towards the back, there are still underwater grenade launchers. This defense system was one of the most effective among the fleet. However, the destroyer didn't stand a chance against the devastating kamikaze attacks. On the 6th of April 1945, it was simultaneously hit by 5 Japanese planes. The first 2 hit the back end and destroyed the propeller and the helm. The third plane hit the communication post on the starboard side, just in front of the mast. The fourth hit the destroyer just above the third attack, but on the port side. The last plane crashed into the front of the ship, just in front of the first cannon. The engine of one of the Japanese aircraft that hit the ship still lies next to the wreckage. As of the evening of the 6th of April 1945, the destroyer was no longer fit for service. The next day, the Americans decided to sink it themselves, rather than to watch it fall into the hands of the Japanese. After the wreck was discovered, the American Army fixed a plaque to it. It pays tribute to each of the sailors who died in combat. Out of the 254 crew members, 52 were killed or disappeared. Almost all of them were reservists. Over the following weeks, military losses accumulated among both the American and Japanese forces. But the soldiers weren't the only ones to lose their lives during the Okinawa invasion. Fearing that defeat was drawing nearer, the Japanese commander decided to encourage civilians to take their own lives.
やはりその当時の一種のプロパガンダでしょうか。そのアメリカ軍が
The propaganda released against the Americans said that it was better to kill oneself rather than to be captured by the enemy, who would then take great pleasure in torturing you.
プロパガンダがある程度徹底をしてたものですから。
This propaganda, which was well established on Saipan and on the other islands, led not only soldiers, but also civilians to kill themselves by jumping off cliffs or blowing themselves up with a grenade. Many people died this way.
亡くなられた方が多かったと。
On Tokashiki Island, Yoshikatsu Yoshikawa has agreed to talk about this dark period of Japanese history. He takes us to the exact place where the authorities from his village gathered the inhabitants on that fateful day in March 1945 to organize their collective suicide. He was 6 years old at the time. It wasn't long after the Americans invaded. Planes and artillery shells were flying around above their heads.
We came here from our anti-air raid shelters by following the river. When I got here, it was already full of people standing in groups of families. Shortly afterwards, the mayor shouted, "Long live the emperor!" My older brother, who was 16 and worked at the town hall, came over to us with 2 grenades in his hand and said, "It's our turn to do it now." We stood in a circle, and my brother tapped the grenade against a stone before throwing it between us. But even after 5 seconds, then 10 seconds, the grenade still hadn't exploded. My brother took the second one and did the same thing. But that one didn't explode either. My mother said to my older brother, "Yosuke, get rid of these grenades and follow our cousins. It's not our time to die."
Yoshikatsu and his mother were able to flee. However, this young boy's father was fatally wounded by a grenade explosion. Just like him, almost 400 inhabitants met their demise over the course of this day of absurdity. In total, there were 220,000 Japanese deaths and 12,000 American deaths in Okinawa within less than 3 months of fighting. The names of the dead from the 2 camps are written on the Peace Memorial stelae on the main island of Okinawa. These colossal losses had an immediate impact on the next part of the war. Okinawa would be the last battleground for the Pacific military campaign.
The Americans, when they assessed the losses of this amphibious battle, wow, an amphibious assault on the main islands, this is going to be extremely costly in terms of lives lost and wounded. And the war in Europe was already over in May of '45. And I think the American leadership also felt the Americans just wanted to bring the boys home, and preferably not in a box.
The American commander therefore changed tactics, stop invading the main islands of Japan. His aim? To speed up the mass bombing of the archipelago in order to force the emperor to surrender. For the first 6 months of 1945, 67 cities had already been hit and largely destroyed, including Tokyo. In August of '45, it would be Hiroshima and Nagasaki's turn to be reduced to ashes by a previously unused weapon that would change the face of the world forever, the atomic bomb.
Why the Americans dropped 2 atomic bombs in quick succession in Japan is a topic of heated debate even today. So first of all, there's the orthodox view. Truman dropped the bombs to end the war quickly and save 1 million American lives. Now, in revisionist interpretations, there's also many different explanations. One is the atomic bombs were essentially the first shot of the Cold War. That was to demonstrate to Stalin that we had this miraculous new weapon that established the United States as the sole superpower.
For this final bombing, the United States wanted to inflict as much damage as they could to the enemy. They chose between 5 cities: Hiroshima, Nagasaki, Kokura, Niigata, and Kyoto, all of which at that point had been carefully spared the onslaught of regular bombings. They ultimately chose Hiroshima, a city with 350,000 inhabitants and a large military facility.
According to archive documents, the American Army were looking for a city that was big enough and spread out on a fairly flat surface so that they could test the capacity of their new bomb. They also chose cities that hadn't yet been bombed so that they could measure the atomic bomb's impact.
On the 6th of August 1945 at 2:45 in the morning, the Flying Fortress B-29 called Enola Gay took off from the American base, Tinian, in the Mariana Islands. At 8:15, the plane dropped the first atomic bomb that history had ever seen over the city of Hiroshima. Within a few seconds, the city was reduced to nothing. Almost 70% of the buildings were destroyed and around 140,000 people were killed. This horrific death toll is due to the location the Americans chose to explode the bomb on. On the 6th of June, the plane flew over Hiroshima at an altitude of 31,500 feet. The target chosen was the Aioi Bridge because of its T-shape, which was easily discernible from the sky. At 8:15, it dropped its bomb just next to its initial target, above Shima Hospital, located 2/10 of a mile from the bridge. This point would later be known as Hypocenter or Ground Zero. Within a few seconds, the little boy bomb explosion decimated the city. The damage spread over a surface area of 4.6 square miles. The effects of the bomb were so devastating because it didn't explode on land, but at altitude, an altitude that was specifically chosen to maximize the damage. Little Boy exploded 2,000 feet above the ground. It caused an initial shockwave which spread like a fireball. This wave was reflected back from the ground and created a second wave, which then spread extremely fast and eventually merged with the first wave. This is called the Mach stem effect. When the two shock waves combine, they create an overpressure at the front, parallel to the ground, which raises everything in its path to the ground. After the explosion, the Mach stem effect destroyed nearly all of the buildings as envisaged by the Americans. However, one of them stood its ground, the Genbaku Dome. Built in 1915 out of brick and concrete rather than wood, like traditional Japanese buildings, this commercial exhibition hall was topped with a steel-framed elliptical dome clad with copper. Standing at a height of 82 feet, it was something of a landmark for the inhabitants of Hiroshima. The reason the building didn't completely crumble during the explosion is because it was right by the hypocenter, just 150 meters northwest of it. It was too close to suffer the devastating effect of the horizontal blast from the Mach stem effect. It was hit vertically, and yet its concrete pillars managed to resist the impact from the top to bottom. The extreme temperatures caused by the incandescent gas carbonized everything that was even remotely combustible. The 140 people who were inside the building were killed on the spot. The copper from the dome melted instantly. But the steel structure, concrete and bricks, managed to resist the heat. This is the reason why part of the building still stood among the rubble. 70 years later, the Genbaku Dome is still there. The local council actually decided to keep it as it was in 1945. It became the city's symbol and was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It is now one of the only remaining buildings that date back to the explosion. The rest of the city has been completely rebuilt.
構造上の理もあって、この建物全部は倒壊しなかったと言われています。で、その後ですね、火事、後の大火事というのが、
Ribun Keio is a medical researcher. Touched by an encounter with a Hiroshima survivor when he was a teenager, he quickly became interested in the remains that the bomb had left behind. For the last 13 years, he has been conducting his own archaeological searches and is still able to find traces of that horrible day in August 1945. Accompanied by his former professor, he explores the Motoyasu riverbed at the foot of the Hiroshima Dome.
あった。ありました。
Ah, I found one.
わあ、もうはい。
It's from a corner. That's quite a rare piece.
両面についてるから。はい。
Ribun is only able to carry out his searches in the early hours of the morning or in the evening, when the riverbed is exposed by low tide. The water is less than 10 degrees centigrade, and the stones are slippery and covered in mud. He works in awful search conditions, but Ribun still manages to find little nuggets of the past. Like this tile, which once sat atop a house near the dome. It's perfectly bicolored, as if someone had painted half of it.
これは原爆の熱線で溶けた屋根瓦です。
You can clearly see the part of the tile that was burnt from the heat of the explosion. We reckon that the heat emitted by the atomic bomb reached around 4,000 degrees Celsius for 2 seconds, which left behind these similar marks on the tiles. It's actually a handy way of distinguishing the objects that date from that period from others.
In 1955, Hiroshima City built the Peace Memorial to showcase objects that dated from the explosion. As a place of memories and collections, the museum has collected more than 20,000 objects that have been brought in by survivors or found during archaeological searches. Each individual remain tells its own story of the bombing. A clock, frozen at the exact time of the explosion. The carbonized child's bike and helmet, the ragged clothes of a school child, or the box of rice of a young boy who'd been enlisted to work in the city but would never eat his meal. There's also this wall face, which people still worship 70 years later, another shadow of the bomb's damage. This reconstruction, which was filmed after the explosion, shows what trace would have been left on the ground of a man sat waiting for the bank to open. The atomic explosion set off such a bright flash of light that it discolored all surfaces, everywhere apart from areas covered by objects or humans. An exhaust pipe, a plumbing valve, a flower pot, all imprinted on the ground as shadows for years. In the city, the atomic bomb explosion rendered 18 hospitals and 32 clinics inoperable. 90% of the medical staff were either injured or died. Nobody was able to look after the survivors, who were often gravely injured. The greatest confusion lay amongst the rubble. But off the coast of Hiroshima, a small island was spared. Ninoshima Island, which is where thousands of injured civilians were taken after the bombing. Ribun Keio decided to carry out some searches there to find the last remains from this period. The buildings have now disappeared, but during the Second World War, the island accommodated a large military hospital.
There was a quarantine area here where Japanese soldiers who came back from the front line would have a medical examination to make sure that they weren't carrying any diseases. They had the same type of building for the horses who had been at the front line during the war. The one that used to be here in front of where we are now was used for army horses.
Today, these buildings have been destroyed and completely covered in vegetation. But Ribun is still able to uncover the old foundations of the military hospital. This is where those who were injured from the explosion were brought in 1945. Ribun Keio dug for 2 months at the site of the old quarantine center for horses. He was only able to extract a few items from the soil: a vial, a comb, a pipe, some shirt buttons, and even a belt buckle.
I imagine it was left behind when they collected the bones. It was my first find. It takes me back to a touching memory that I have, which really made me aware of the fact that I'm in a place where humans were killed and buried.
Most of the Hiroshima bomb survivors on Ninoshima Island didn't survive. There were no funerals or final tributes here. Some of the victims were incinerated in this furnace where dead horses used to be burnt. Others were buried in staggered rows in communal graves dug out by soldiers. Hundreds of bodies have since been exhumed and transported to the tomb of the unknown victims at the Hiroshima Memorial. At the time of the explosion, the Little Boy bomb emitted a huge quantity of radioactivity, which spread an insidious evil throughout the city. Vomiting, diarrhea, hair loss. Many inhabitants who escaped the explosion or fires would later die of disease. The radiation levels have now returned to normal in Hiroshima. In order to find traces of the devastating effects of the atomic bomb, it is worth visiting the Radiation Effects Research Foundation. This is where medical files are kept on the thousands of survivors of the explosion. Founded by the Americans in 1947 under the name of the Atomic Bomb Casualty Commission, the center is now a Japan-US foundation managed by both nations. Since the war, and to this day, Hiroshima survivors still come here to have their state of health monitored.
These are relatively normal examinations. We basically take a patient's height and weight, make a note of their state of health, as well as any history of illness in the family. And we take an X-ray of the rib cage and an ultrasound of the heart.
The commission left some very bad memories with the Japanese people. After the war, while Japan was still occupied by America, the facility was accused of treating survivors like guinea pigs.
I'm told that while the area was under occupation from the Americans, the survivors were taken there by force, and the first years were difficult. But since the survivor group was established in 1958, after the end of the occupation, we know that the survivors have come and participated of their own free will.
The Foundation has also carefully looked after some biological samples taken from the survivors. Approximately 1 million blood and urine samples have been used to observe the impact of radiation on the human body, the immune system, and cells. Some have been kept filed away since 1947. Other more recent samples have been conserved in liquid nitrogen at -195 degrees Celsius.
These are survivor blood cells. They've been kept in this liquid nitrogen tanks for decades so that we can use them for future research. We're carrying out studies on the immune system, particularly the functioning of white cells.
This is the vastest epidemiological study of the effects of radiation. Most of what we know about cancers and other diseases caused by radiation come from Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
Well, I think that survivors of the atomic bombing felt that they were mistreated, that they went to this American center hoping to get medical treatment, but in fact they were treated something like guinea pigs. I think that that over time gave way to a feeling that their sacrifice should not be in vain. Yes, I was subjected to this. Yes, I've suffered, but hopefully the world will learn the lessons of the horrors of atomic bombs, and that my body will, in a sense, provide evidence.
Despite the devastation at Hiroshima, Emperor Hirohito refused to surrender. Only 3 days after the first atomic bomb, the Americans decided to hit Japan again.
3 days apart. That didn't really give the Japanese leadership very much time to assess the damage and to figure out what should we do about this. So it's often argued by scholars that one of the main reasons why they dropped the bombs so quickly and they really rushed it was they wanted Japan to surrender before Soviet Union could enter the war and lay claim to a joint occupation of Japan.
On the 9th of August, 1945, at 3:49 in the morning, another B-29 plane set off, flanked by Fat Man, an even more powerful bomb than the one dropped on Hiroshima. But this one was made of plutonium. Its target, Kokura City. But once it approached its destination, clouds gathered above the region. The pilot canceled the bomb drop and set off in the direction of the second city on the list, Nagasaki. The initial target was the city center, just next to the port. But on that fateful August morning, the sky was slightly obscured, and the pilot dropped the bomb at the wrong location. At 11:02, Fat Man exploded 2 miles further away, above the Urakami Valley. Similarly to Hiroshima, the shockwave ran parallel to the ground and devastated everything in its path. But it was blocked by the hills surrounding the valley. The most populated part of Nagasaki was spared, and the damage was confined to the hypocenter of the explosion. The damage in the Urakami Valley was huge. 3.1 square miles destroyed and 75,000 dead. The city has now been rebuilt, but Ground Zero remains a particularly moving place of remembrance. Some souvenirs recall the scale of the disaster, like this sacred gate split in half. In Nagasaki, the symbol of the bombing is a cathedral, the Urakami Cathedral. It was located only 3/10 of a mile from the hypocenter. Today, the statues found in the rubble are exhibited in the front of the new building. Back in the day, it was one of the biggest churches in Asia. Nagasaki was therefore a historic hub for Christians in Japan, especially Catholics. Shigemi Fukuhori is one of the loyal parishioners. On the 9th of August, 1945, he was working in the city's shipyard, located 1.9 miles from the hypocenter. Meanwhile, the church was a hive of activity.
The 15th of August is the day of Assumption of the Virgin Mary. And many believers were at the church to prepare for the event and confess their sins. Moreover, since it was the school holidays, 15 children had come to the church as well as 2 priests to carry out the confessions. All of them perished after the bomb exploded. Before I came back here, I was convinced that the church had held its ground because it's a big, solid building. But when I got to Ground Zero, the view was different. And that's when I noticed that I couldn't see the church bells anymore. At that point, I lost all hope that my house had been spared.
On the 9th of August, 1945, the cathedral was hit full-on by the blast of the bomb. It was pulverized. After the explosion, the statue of Christ was turned upside down. Part of the facade and some of the wall faces that remained intact looked out over a post-apocalyptic landscape. The rest of the building was razed to the ground, including the bell, which hurtled down the hill. Today, it has been left in the same place, a lasting reminder of the explosion, embedded in the middle of the city. The church was rebuilt so that worship could continue and so that people would be reminded of how Christians in Japan had been persecuted for centuries. Among the remains of the building that resisted the explosion, there's one particularly interesting piece, one that gave hope to the loyal parishioners. The face of the Virgin Mary, which has now been nicknamed the Bombed Virgin. The statue was discovered by a priest from Hokkaido who kept it to himself before giving it back 30 years later.
We thought that at one time her eyes were made out of crystal, but I think they were glass. They melded. But only the eyes melded, and the rest of the wooden face has been preserved. It's a miracle. I think it must have been the Virgin Mary's way of showing us just how evil the war was.
The names of loyal parishioners who died in the bombing are inscribed in this room, in front of the bust of the Virgin. Of the 12,000 Christians in the Urakami Valley, 8,500 were killed by the Fat Man bomb. Among them were Shigemi Fukuhori's 3 brothers. After this double atomic bomb attack, Emperor Hirohito declared Japan's unconditional surrender.
これは実は
More than 100,000 Japanese had already been killed in the Tokyo bomb raid on the 10th of March 1945, which equates to the equivalent loss of human life that occurred in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Despite everything, the Imperial military headquarters still decided to fight to the bitter end. But after Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the fact that so many Japanese civilians had been killed by a single bomb made the military headquarters finally realize that they had to stop sacrificing innocent people.
Hiroshima and Nagasaki obviously helped speed up Japan's surrender, but there was another factor at play. On the 9th of August, the same day as the Nagasaki attack, Stalin decided to invade Manchukuo, a state controlled by Japan.
All of the generals were aware of what happened to the Tsar in the communist revolution. And so if they really wanted to preserve the emperor, the last thing that they could allow was Stalin to jointly occupy Japan. That would be a much greater threat. So surrendering to the Americans was considered the lesser of evils. And the military, because of the atomic bomb, could save face. They did not lose on the battlefield.
After the Bloody War, the fall of the Japanese Empire sent the country into a new era. The emperor lost his divine reputation, and Japan became a democracy. 70 years later, the work done by archaeologists and numerous survivor accounts are all reminders of the price this country paid to be rebuilt. They have helped put together a dark chapter of history so that future generations never forget those days in August 1945 when the atomic bomb hit the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki.